The Drakeni Hegemony, a shimmering wall of 3,000 gold-plated warships, materialized at the edge of the Sol system with the arrogance of a predator entering an undefended nursery. Overlord Val-Karr stood on his bridge, his multiple optical sensors gleaming with what could only be described as smug satisfaction. He looked at the blue marble below, Earth, and saw nothing but a primitive planet ripe for exploitation. He had heard the whispers of Deathworlders, apex predators born from a planet so hostile that merely existing there was a military exercise, but he dismissed them as folklore. "System scan," Val-Karr commanded. The results confirmed his assumptions. The human ships were cold, with minimal energy signatures and no charged weapons. They looked like harmless debris or weather satellites. Val-Karr did not realize that human engineering was designed to look harmless, right up until the exact moment a trap was sprung. He expected a transmission of terror, a frantic plea for mercy, or perhaps a desperate display of outdated missiles. Instead, the speakers crackled with a voice that was smooth, calm, and spoke perfect Galactic standard with an accent of terrifying certainty. "Attention Drakeni Fleet, this is Chief Actuary Alaric Thorne of the Sol Ledger Authority," the man said, sounding more like he was ordering a morning beverage than facing extinction. "You have entered restricted airspace without a permit. More importantly, we've been reviewing the historical data of the Drakeni Hegemony's expansion. It seems your ancestors neglected to pay the transit fees for the Orion Arm 3 centuries ago. Including interest, late penalties, and administrative costs, the Drakeni Hegemony currently owes the people of Earth exactly 4 times its current annual GDP. Would you like to pay by credit, or should we begin the asset seizure?" Overlord Val-Karr laughed, a sound like grinding stones. "You dare mock the hegemony? We have warships that can glass a planet, and you send a bureaucrat to talk about debt? Surrender 90% of your resources now, or we will leave nothing but floating wreckage." On Earth, in a command center buried 3 kilometers beneath a mountain range, Alaric Thorne took a slow, deliberate sip of coffee from a mug that read, "Galaxy's Accountant." He didn't look at the screen. He looked at his spreadsheets, which were far more accurate than any military intelligence. He smiled, showing too many teeth, a gesture that on Earth was for happiness, but everywhere else was a threat display. "I'll take that as a refusal to pay," Thorne said quietly, his voice hardening like steel. "Now I'm actually getting annoyed." Suddenly the sensors on every Drakeni ship began to scream as the harmless human debris field surrounding the fleet blazed to life, and Val-Karr realized the prey had been the hunter all along. The debris field surrounding the Drakeni Hegemony did not explode into fire. It blossomed into a grid of shimmering violet energy. Overlord Val-Karr watched his tactical display as the weather satellites and mining drones shed their outer casings, revealing high-output sensor arrays and localized gravity wells. The human ships weren't just hot, they were pulsing with energy signatures that made the Hegemony's ancient, jewel-encrusted scanners whine in protest. "Target all active contacts," Val-Karr bellowed, his voice echoing through the massive gold-plated bridge. "Show these accountants the price of insolence. Total annihilation. Fire!" The Drakeni weapons officers slammed their primary manipulators onto the firing triggers. They expected the roar of plasma cannons and the scream of quantum torpedoes. Instead, the bridge was filled with a sound far more terrifying, a rhythmic, polite chime. Every view screen in the fleet turned blood red, displaying a single block of text in perfect, clinical Drakeni script. "Critical account lockout." "Report!" Val-Karr shrieked, his eye stalks twitching in a stress response usually reserved for a hull breach. "Sir?" His tactical officer stammered, his scales fading to a pale, sickly gray. "The firing computers, they've been remotely disabled. The system is reporting a licensing violation." On the main holocam, Alaric Thorne took another sip of coffee, the steam fogging his glasses for a brief second before he cleared them with practiced calm. "You see, Overlord, 3 decades ago, a human shell company known as Vane and Associates quietly purchased the intellectual property rights to the Nebula X targeting core used in 98% of your fleet," Thorne explained conversationally. "The end-user license agreement, which your military contractors signed without reading, specifically prohibits the use of the software for unprovoked aggression against the patent holders. You are currently in breach of contract." "This is a trick!" Val-Karr roared, slamming a fist onto his obsidian console. "Manually override the safeties. Use the emergency triggers." "We already tried, sir," the officer replied, his voice trembling. The humans didn't just lock the software, they've initiated a physical asset repossession protocol. Look at the exterior hull monitors. Val-Karr turned his sensors toward the edge of his formation. Thousands of small, sleek human craft were moving in. They weren't warships, they lacked visible cannons or missile racks. Instead, they were equipped with massive industrial-grade plasma cutters and high-tension tractor beams. They moved with the surgical, eerie coordination of pack predators who had practiced this maneuver 1,000 times before. "We aren't here to fight a war, Val-Karr," Thorne said, his voice dropping to that cold, dangerous whisper that signaled the end of patience. "Wars are messy, expensive, and bad for the quarterly reports. We are here to seize collateral. Since you cannot pay the debt, we are taking your ships for their scrap value." The first human salvage drone latched onto the Drakeni ship Starcracker. The gold plating, meant to signify the hegemony's divine right to rule, began to peel away under a high-intensity laser like tinfoil. "I will not be humiliated by a species that fights with spreadsheets." Val-Karr screamed, his pride crumbling into a sandcastle in a tsunami. "Activate the Forbidden Pulse! Burn the entire system!" "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Thorne warned, looking down at a new notification on his tablet. "My team just informed me that your homeworld's central bank just had its credit rating downgraded to junk status. Do you know what humans do when a debtor becomes a liability?" Before Val-Karr could answer, the Drakeni flagship's main reactor began to cycle down into an emergency hibernation mode. The golden bridge of the Drakeni flagship, the pride of the core, was shrouded in an eerie red emergency glow. Overlord Val-Karr felt his three stomachs churn as he stared at the silent consoles. For a species that prided itself on overwhelming military might, being defeated by a licensing agreement was a humiliation that transcended physical pain. "Director Thorne!" Val-Karr hissed into the still active comms channel, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and burgeoning terror. "You cannot simply repossess a galactic hegemony. This is a violation of every known treaty." On the view screen, Alaric Thorne adjusted his tie with clinical precision. He looked less like a man facing a space armada, and more like a teacher preparing to grade a particularly failing student. "Actually, Overlord, we reviewed those treaties too. Specifically the Sovereign Debt Clause of the Galactic Commerce Accords. Since your empire used human-patented slipspace stabilizers to reach this system, you've effectively been renting the vacuum of space from us at a compounded interest rate of 12% per annum." Thorne leaned forward, the light from his tablet reflecting off his glasses. "Every second your fleet remains in Sol without a valid transit visa, the fine doubles. As of 4 seconds ago, the Drakeni Hegemony has officially spent its entire planetary reserve of chromium just to keep the lights on in your mess hall. You aren't just losing a war, Val-Karr. You're becoming mathematically impossible." Val-Karr turned to his secondary brain, desperate for a tactical opening. "We still have the Shadow Guard. Boarding pods are manual, they don't need software." He slammed a secondary manipulator onto a physical lever. "Launch the infiltrators, scuttle their audit center, and bring me Thorne's head." The Drakeni Shadow Guard, elite killers trained from birth in 17 different arts of termination, launched in silent, jagged pods. They were the hegemony's ultimate insurance, the things that lived in the dark and made the galaxy behave. They expected a frantic defense. Instead, they found the human command center's airlocks wide open. Waiting for them was not a squad of soldiers, but a single woman in a gray business suit holding a digital clipboard. "Welcome," she said pleasantly, her eyes hard and cold like compressed neutronium. "My name is Senior Adjuster Mira. You're currently 3 minutes late for your scheduled mediation. Please surrender your weapons. They've already been listed as tax-deductible losses on your Emperor's latest filing." The lead Shadow Guard lunged with a monomolecular blade. Mira didn't flinch. She simply tapped a key on her clipboard. A localized gravity field, tuned specifically to the density of Drakeni armor, slammed the entire boarding party into the floor with the force of a falling moon. Humanity learned a long time ago that cooperation is more profitable than conflict. Thorne's voice echoed over the station's intercom as he watched the failed boarding attempt. "But we also learned that if someone chooses violence, you'd better have a response ready that makes them regret being born." Thorne's smile vanished, replaced by an expression that reminded Val-Karr of the ancient predators from Earth's deepest myths. "We've been very patient, Overlord. We played the part of the model citizen, the helpful neighbor, and the peaceful trader. But you mistook our preference for peace as an inability to wage war. Now, I'm done being patient. I'm moving your account to aggressive collection. On the tactical display, 4,000 new human contacts suddenly appeared. Not salvage drones this time, but ships that space itself seemed to recoil from. They weren't just ships. They were nightmares. Humanity had kept locked away until the galaxy proved it couldn't be trusted with peace. "Wait!" Val-Karr shouted, his pride finally shattering into dust. "We can negotiate. We can pay." "Oh, you will pay," Thorne said, standing up and closing his laptop. "But the interest rate just went up. We aren't auditing your fleet anymore, Overlord. We're auditing your existence." The human fleet began to move, and for the first time in 300 cycles, the Drakeni Hegemony realized that the death world of Earth hadn't produced victims. It had produced the galaxy's most efficient executioners. The silence on the bridge of the Pride of the Core was heavier than the localized gravity that had just crushed the Shadow Guard. Overlord Val-Karr stared at the flickering holographic display of his home system, Drakeni Prime. Usually it was a vibrant hub of golden light and imperial glory, but now, every sector was flashing a deep, systemic amber. His communications officer, whose scales were now a translucent white of absolute terror, pointed a trembling manipulator at a data stream. "Overlord, it's not just the fleet," the officer whispered. "The Grand Sovereign's central vault on Drakeni Prime. The automated locks have engaged. The Imperial Treasury is reporting a security escrow hold. Our entire economy has just been placed in a digital cage." Val-Karr's optical sensors pulsed in disbelief. "How? We have the most secure encryption in the spiral arm. We have never shared our banking protocols with anyone." "Actually," Alaric Thorne interrupted, his voice echoing through the bridge with the hollow resonance of a judge in a cathedral. "You've been sharing them for 82 years. You just never noticed who was doing the filing." Thorne adjusted a small dial on his console, and the view screen split. On one side was the desperate Overlord. On the other was a high-resolution feed of the Drakeni Imperial Court. In the very back row of the Emperor's prestigious council chamber, behind the golden-clad advisors and the armored generals, sat 3 humans in plain, charcoal-gray suits. They weren't speaking. They weren't posturing. They were simply holding data tablets, their eyes tracking every movement in the room with the quiet intensity of predators watching a slow-motion car crash. "The back row!" Val-Karr breathed, his mandibles clicking in a horrified realization. "You've been there the whole time. It's a human specialty," Thorne said, leaning back as the hum of his command center deepened. "Everyone wants the front row. Everyone wants the prestige, the spotlights, and the seats closest to power. But the front row is for performance. The back row, that's for perspective. While your emperor was busy making speeches about eternal dominance, my colleagues were busy auditing your supply chains. We didn't need to hack your systems, Val-Karr. We just waited for you to outsource your boring administrative labor to our cheap frontier consultants." A sudden jolt rocked the flagship. The exterior cameras showed a massive human vessel, the Audit-class supercarrier Total Recall, moving into position. It wasn't firing weapons. It was extending a web of blue-white light that looked like a spider's silk, made of pure energy. "What is that?" Val-Karr screamed. "That is a debt collection field," Thorne replied, his expression becoming dangerously clinical. "It's currently vibrating the atomic structure of your hull at a frequency that identifies which parts of your ship were built, using raw materials stolen from the Outer Rim colonies. Since those colonies are now human protectorates, those materials are being unbonded from your ship." Outside, the gold plating on the escort destroyers began to dissolve into fine metallic mist, which was instantly sucked into the human carrier's intake vents. The Hegemony's pride was being literally stripped away, atom by atom, to pay for interest. "Stop this!" Val-Karr pleaded, his voice cracking. "My emperor will pay. We will retreat. We will give you the mineral rights to the entire sector. The mineral rights you're offering were already sold to us by your own Treasury Secretary 40 minutes ago to pay for your fleet's emergency fuel tax," Thorne said, checking a ticking clock on his screen. "You see, Val-Karr, you think this is a war, but for us this is just a final notice. You crossed a line when you threatened Earth. You mistook our patience for weakness and our politeness for softness. But humans from a death world don't just survive. We organize." Thorne's finger hovered over a large, glowing red icon on his tablet. "We've finished the audit. The Hegemony is officially insolvent. We are now moving into the total liquidation phase. Do you have any final words for the record? Or should I just let the algorithms handle the rest?" Val-Karr looked at his tactical officer, then back at the screen, seeing the thousands of human drones now latching onto the pride of the Corps like a swarm of angry, logistical hornets. How, Val-Karr whispered, how could a species that smiles so much be so cold? Because, Thorne said, his smile vanishing entirely to reveal the predator beneath, we know exactly what happens when we're not. The icon on Thorne's screen turned from amber to a blinding, cold blue. The command for total liquidation did not manifest as a barrage of missiles or a blinding flash of antimatter. Instead, the void around the Drakeni Hegemony became a hive of terrifyingly efficient industrial activity. Thousands of human salvage drones, which Overlord Val-Karr had initially dismissed as primitive mining equipment, surged forward with the clinical precision of a surgeon and the hunger of a locust swarm. These were not warships designed for the glory of combat that the hegemony understood. They were tools of entropy. They did not seek to defeat the Drakeni. They sought to unmake them. High-frequency resonance cutters began vibrating the molecular bonds of the hegemony's dreadnoughts, causing massive sections of gold-plated hull to simply slide away like dead skin. Overlord Val-Karr watched in paralyzed horror as his fleet was converted into a massive logistics problem. The Sovereign's Wrath, a heavy cruiser once capable of glassing continents, had its primary weapon arrays neatly detached by tractor beams and pulled into the dark maws of human cargo haulers. Its legendary defensive grid was not breached by force, but uninstalled by a remote software patch that Alaric Thorne had authorized from the back row of his command center. Millions of Drakeni warriors trained for the Great War found themselves utterly useless as their life support pods were gently ejected into the void, tagged with digital markers designating them as excess personnel. Val-Karr shrieked at the view screen, his primary optical sensors twitching as he saw his own bridge's ceiling begin to retract, revealing the cold, indifferent stars above. He accused Thorne of barbarism, claiming the humans were dismantling his legacy while his warriors were still inside. Thorne did not even look up from his datapad, busy cross-referencing the scrap value of Drakeni alloys against the current market rates in the Proxima sector. He informed the Overlord that barbarism implied a lack of structure, whereas this was simply a foreclosure of assets. He explained that Val-Karr was currently occupying a vessel that belonged to the Sol Ledger Authority due to sovereign default, and that they were merely preparing the assets for secondary markets. The Overlord's pride, a structure built on 300 cycles of undisputed dominance, finally snapped. He lunged for the manual Divine Retribution lever, a weapon that used the flagship's core to create a localized supernova. He roared that he would burn the ledgers and erase the spreadsheets with fire. Thorne paused, setting his coffee mug down with a soft, final click that seemed to echo through the Drakeni bridge. He looked directly into the camera, and for the first time, Val-Karr saw the truth of the Deathworlder stories. It wasn't the weapons that were scary, it was the restraint that was now disappearing. Thorne quietly noted that the Drakeni had been given 3 warnings: the polite request, the notification of debt, and the seizure of collateral. He then stated that he was actually getting annoyed. Suddenly, the liquidation speed tripled. The pride of the Corps began to groan as its structural integrity was compromised by human drones drilling into the reactor core. Thorne mentioned that the audit was the gentle part, the paperwork. But since Val-Karr had chosen to threaten a supernova event, his jurisdiction had officially ended. Massive, jagged monsters of black iron and plasma uncloaked at the edge of the system, ships that didn't appear in any galactic database. Thorne identified them as the varsity team, the actual military who didn't care about scrap value, only the mess being made. A single human ship, larger than the Drakeni flagship, uncloaked directly in front of the bridge, its weapons already glowing with a hunger that mathematics couldn't satisfy. The transition from the Ledger Authority to the human military was not a change in volume, but a change in temperature. The varsity team did not broadcast polite warnings or offer payment plans. Their ships, jagged monoliths of matte black carbon lattice, did not reflect the light of the sun. They seemed to consume it. As the Absolute Zero, the lead dreadnought of the Terran Blackwatch, moved into the center of the Drakeni formation, the air on Overlord Val-Karr's bridge grew thin and metallic. Val-Karr, stripped of his gold plating and his dignity, watched the tactical screen with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. "If they want my life, they will pay in blood," he snarled to his remaining bridge crew. "The audit is over. This is the death ground now. Release the Calyx Mist." If we cannot have this system, no carbon-based life form will ever breathe here again. The Calyx Mist was the Drakeni Hegemony's ultimate forbidden tool. It was a self-replicating molecular virus designed to target the basic bonding agents in DNA. On more than a dozen worlds, it had turned entire civilizations into gray sludge in less than an hour. Val-Karr watched as the green, bioluminescent gas vented from his flagship's remaining auxiliary ports, clouding the space between the pride of the core and the approaching human boarding craft. He expected the human ships to veer away, to flee from the invisible microscopic death. Instead, the human boarding pods accelerated. They punched through the green haze with total indifference, slamming into the Drakeni hull with enough force to rattle Val-Karr's primary internal organs. On the bridge, the emergency seals hissed as 3 human soldiers in sleek, lightweight tactical gear stepped through a freshly cut breach. They weren't wearing the heavy, lead-lined environmental suits Val-Karr expected. They wore simple filtered masks and pressurized fatigues. The lead soldier, a woman with a patch on her shoulder that depicted a skull wearing a headset, stepped toward the Overlord. She didn't raise a weapon. She simply sniffed the air, her mask filtering the concentrated Calyx Mist that was currently eating through the gold filigree on the bridge walls. "Command, this is Captain Miller," she said into her comms, her voice sounding bored. "The target has deployed some kind of aerosolized irritant. It's got a bit of a kick. Reminds me of that ghost pepper extract the guys in engineering were messing with last Tuesday." Val-Karr staggered back, his multiple arms flailing. You should be melting. That is the God Killer. It uncurls the very threads of life." Captain Miller tilted her head, looking at the green mist swirling around her glove. "Oh, that? We did a scan. It's a pretty clever little pathogen. Back on Earth, we'd call it a spicy afternoon. Our immune systems have been fighting things 10 times more aggressive than this since we were in diapers. We literally evolved on a planet that tries to poison us every time the seasons change." She stepped closer, the magnetic boots of her suit clanking rhythmically on the deck. "Director Thorne was the nice one, Overlord. He wanted your money. We just want to make sure you never make a mess like this again. You tried to poison a species that drinks fermented grain and eats capsicum for fun. Do you have any idea how insulted we are by the quality of your biowarfare?" Val-Karr looked at his tactical officer, but the officer was already on the floor, his own virus, unintentionally mutated by the human presence, turning against him. The God Killer was failing because the humans were, quite literally, too toxic for it to handle. "What are you going to do?" Val-Karr whispered, his vision fading. "We're moving to the final stage of the audit," Miller said, reaching for a device on her belt that looked like a simple remote detonator. "But since you tried to use a bioweapon on a civilian-adjacent sector, the Sol Ledger Authority has authorized an ecological restitution fee. And since you can't pay..." She pressed a button, and the pride of the core didn't explode. It began to hum with a frequency that made Val-Karr's bones feel like they were turning into liquid. "We're not just taking your ship, Val-Karr," Miller said, her voice cold and final. "We're taking the memory of it." The hum that had vibrated through the bones of Overlord Val-Karr did not end in an explosion. It ended in a silence so absolute that it felt like a physical weight pressing against his 3-lobed brain. The pride of the core, once the golden symbol of Drakeni dominance, was no longer a ship. It had been reduced to a skeletal framework of raw carbon and base elements, stripped of its history, its weapons, and its purpose. Val-Karr found himself sitting in a transparent containment cell, suspended in the middle of a massive human hangar bay, looking out at the stars of his own home system, Drakeni Prime. He had been transported across the sector in what the humans called a high-speed logistics corridor, a feat of engineering the Hegemony had considered theoretically impossible for at least another 1,000 years. Through the shimmering energy field of his cell, Val-Karr watched the bridge of the human command ship. It was not a place of war. There were no battle maps or tactical displays showing kill counts. Instead, the walls were covered in live data streams of energy markets, mineral exchange rates, and a massive ticking countdown labeled Escrow Finalization. Chief Actuary Alaric Thorne stood by the viewport, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the Drakeni sun. To any other species, the star was a source of life and a symbol of the Emperor's divine light. To Thorne, it looked like a massive, untapped battery that had been left running in an empty room. Val-Karr slammed his remaining primary fist against the containment field, his voice hoarse from screaming. He demanded to know why they were here and why the humans had brought their audit to the heart of the Hegemony. He pointed out that the fleet was gone and the assets were seized. He begged Thorne to leave the civilian population alone. Thorne turned slowly, his expression not one of cruelty, but of the weary disappointment of a landlord who had discovered a tenant had been subletting to a criminal syndicate. He walked over to the cell, holding his ever-present digital tablet, and adjusted his glasses. Thorne explained that the fleet was merely a down payment. He noted that the interest on 300 years of unpaid transit fees, combined with the ecological restitution fee for the attempted use of the Calyx Mist, had reached a threshold where the hegemony's physical assets, planets, moons, and stations, were no longer sufficient to cover the balance. He told Val-Karr that the Sol Ledger Authority had been forced to look at the Drakeni system's primary energy source. As he spoke, Val-Karr looked out the viewport and saw something that froze his blood. Thousands of small, hexagonal mirrors were beginning to unfurl around the Drakeni sun. They weren't ships. They were segments of a Dyson swarm, a project so vast it should have taken centuries to construct. Val-Karr realized then that the humans hadn't just been watching from the back row. They had been building. While the Drakeni were busy conquering local systems with fire and sword, human mining corporations and survey teams had been quietly moving into the worthless asteroid belts of the Drakeni home system. They had been pre-positioning the components for a total energy monopoly. Thorne checked his watch and noted that the solar repossession was ahead of schedule. He explained that as of this moment, the Drakeni Hegemony no longer owned the light of their own star. It had been legally designated as defaulted utility collateral. The mirrors began to align, and for the first time in the history of the Drakeni people, the sun began to dim. It wasn't an eclipse. It was a controlled dimming, a visual representation of a species losing its power in real time. Thorne informed the Overlord that they were now diverting 95% of the star's output to human industrial hubs in the Orion Arm. The remaining 5% would be provided to Drakeni Prime as humanitarian energy credits, enough to keep the planet from freezing, but not enough to power a single shipyard or war foundry. The hegemony was being put on a strict energy allowance. Val-Karr sank to the floor of his cell, his spirit finally crushed by the weight of human logistics. He whispered that they were monsters, worse than any conqueror because they didn't even have the grace to call it a war. Thorne looked at the dying light of the star and admitted that perhaps he was right. He noted that a conqueror eventually leaves or dies, but a creditor is forever. He then tapped a final command on his tablet, and the view screen changed to show the Drakeni Emperor's palace. The God Emperor was currently being served with a physical copy of the final bill by a human clerk who looked remarkably unimpressed by the golden throne. "The audit is officially closed," Thorne said, his voice echoing in the quiet hangar. "Now we move into the management phase. And you, Val-Karr, are going to help us understand why your people thought they could afford a war they hadn't even budgeted for." Suddenly an alarm blared. But it wasn't a human alarm. It was a signal coming from the deep void, far beyond the hegemony's borders. Something that made Thorne's calm expression falter for the very first time. The alarm that pulsed through the hangar was not a rhythmic chime of human bureaucracy or the grinding roar of Drakeni war horns. It was a sound that felt like a cold blade sliding between the stars, a high-frequency shriek that bypassed ears and vibrated directly into the primitive centers of the brain. On the bridge of the human flagship, the data streams of energy markets and mineral rights didn't just flicker. They dissolved into static. Overlord Val-Karr, trembling in his containment cell, recognized that sound. It was the silence of the void, the signature of the Ravagers, a nomadic swarm of biomechanical entities that consumed entire star systems before moving on. The Drakeni Hegemony had spent 3 centuries posturing as the galaxy's defenders against this threat, using it as the primary justification for their taxation of other worlds. "You fool!" Val-Karr screamed, his voice breaking as he watched the tactical map show a massive shadow encroaching on the edge of the Drakeni system. "You have dismantled our fleet. You have drained our sun. We were the only wall between this sector and the Maw. By auditing us into bankruptcy, you have signed the death warrant for every living soul in this arm of the galaxy." Alaric Thorne did not look at the Overlord. He didn't even look at the terrifying signatures appearing on the long-range sensors. He simply reached into his suit jacket, pulled out a clean silk handkerchief, and wiped a smudge of dust off his tablet screen. His movements were so precise, so agonizingly slow, that Val-Karr felt a different kind of terror. The realization that Thorne wasn't afraid. "Val-Karr," Thorne said, his voice cutting through the alarm with the sharp edge of a diamond. "Do you truly think we didn't audit the Ravagers too? Do you think a species that manages the logistics of a death world would leave a variable like galactic extinction off the balance sheet? Thorne tapped a final sequence into his tablet. We've been tracking the Ravagers since we first launched a radio wave into the dark. We didn't dismantle your fleet because we were greedy. We dismantled it because your technology was inefficient. Your wall was made of gold-plated cardboard and ego. It wouldn't have lasted 10 minutes against what's coming. Outside the viewport, the Dyson swarm, the thousands of mirrors surrounding the Drakeni sun, suddenly shifted. They didn't just dim the star, they began to focus its light. The energy was channeled into a single, massive human construct at the system's edge. The Sol Ledger Authority's final notice platform. We didn't just buy your sun, Overlord, Thorne continued, turning to face Val-Karr with a look of absolute, terrifying ownership. We repurposed it. You treated war like a sport for glory. We treat it like a waste management project. A beam of focused stellar energy, narrow as a needle but packing the power of 1,000 supernovas, lanced out from the platform. It didn't explode when it hit the lead Ravager vessel. It simply erased it from the fabric of space-time. The great threat that had haunted the Drakeni for eons was being systematically deleted at a rate of 3 ships per second. The Drakeni Hegemony is no longer a sovereign empire, Thorne said, walking toward the hangar exit as the Ravager swarm began a desperate, panicked retreat. As of this moment, you are a wholly owned subsidiary of the Sol Ledger Authority. Your people will be retrained in logistics, your emperor will be given a desk job in accounting, and your children will grow up in a galaxy where predators are just another line item to be managed. Thorne paused at the door, looking back one last time. And Val-Karr, don't look so miserable, you're lucky. We've decided to keep you on as a consultant for historical errors. It's a non-salaried position, but the dental plan is excellent. As the human flagship began to move toward the next system on its list, the galaxy realized a horrifying truth. Humans weren't the new kings. They were something much more permanent. They were the new managers, and they were already looking at the rest of the Galactic Council's books. Deep in the void, another alarm began to sound. This time, it was coming from the center of the galaxy.